In the dusty echoes of ancient China, where bronze bells tolled in the courts of kings and warlords sharpened their blades under the shadow of crumbling Zhou authority, one man dared to ask a question that would alter the trajectory of Chinese civilization. What is the right way to rule? That man was Confucius, known to his students as Junzi, to his contemporaries as a humble teacher from Lu, and to posterity as the sage who redefined ethics, governance, and the soul of a civilization. Power, whether wielded by emperors, ministers, or patriarchs, was no stranger to the world in which Confucius lived. Indeed, the very soil of the spring and autumn period was soaked with ambition, rivalry, and blood. Yet Confucius did not preach rebellion, nor did he glorify the sword. Instead, he offered a vision so radical, so elegant, and so enduring that it would come to shape the moral architecture of East Asia for over 2 millennia. But what did Confucius really teach about power? Was he a conservative upholding hierarchy, or a reformer demanding virtue in rulers? Was his vision naive, or was it a subtle blueprint for restoring order to a fractured world? To answer these questions, we must step beyond the clichés and into the mind of the master himself. We must walk the avenues of ancient Lu, listen to the Analects not as dry aphorisms, but as living conversations, and understand power not merely as force or authority, but as a moral force, what the Chinese call Di, virtue. This is the story of Confucius and the moral mandate of power. To understand Confucius, we must first understand his time. He was born in 551 BCE, during the late spring and autumn period, an era named after the spring and autumn annals of the state of Lu. Though nominally under the Zhou dynasty's rule, China was no longer a unified realm. The Zhou kings, once mighty, had become symbolic figureheads. Real power splintered into the hands of feudal lords, dukes, barons, and kings in all but name, who waged near constant war for territory and supremacy. It was an age of political fragmentation, moral decay, and existential threat to the old order. The rights, that had once governed society with hierarchical harmony were now hollow gestures. Rituals were performed, but their meaning forgotten. Ministers assassinated rulers, sons turned against fathers, and loyalty was traded for profit. A famous adage from the time laments, "The great way has been abandoned, the world is in decline." It was against this backdrop of disintegration that Confucius emerged, not as a general, not as a monarch, but as a teacher, a compiler of ancient wisdom, and a seeker of moral clarity. His central concern was not merely how to rule, but how to be a good ruler, a good minister, a good son, a good human being. And at the heart of all this lay his teachings on power. Confucius's most revolutionary idea was also his most ancient, that rightful power is rooted not in coercion or conquest, but in virtue. He called this virtue Di, a word rich in meaning, encompassing moral character, inner strength, and spiritual integrity. For Confucius, true power radiated outward from the inner cultivation of virtue, like incense spreading its fragrance or a stone rippling the surface of a still pond. In the Analects, Lunyu, Confucius declares, "He who rules by virtue is like the North Star, which remains in place while all the other stars revolve around it." Analects 2.1. This metaphor is profound. The North Star does not compel other stars to orbit it. They do so naturally, drawn by its fixed position and guiding light. Similarly, the virtuous ruler does not need to enforce his will through violence or fear. His conduct inspires loyalty, his justice commands respect, and his example becomes the gravitational center of the state. Contrast this with the ruler who governs through laws and punishments. Confucius warns, "If you govern the people by laws and keep them in line with punishments, they will avoid punishment, but have no sense of shame." If you govern them by virtue and keep them in line with Li, ritual, they will have a sense of shame and will correct themselves. Analects 2.3. Here, shame is not humiliation. It is an inner moral compass, cultivated through education and example. Power, then, is not an external tool, but an internal force. And virtue is not optional. It is the very foundation of legitimacy. Although Confucius did not invent the concept of the mandate of heaven, Tianming, he reinterpreted it in a way that forever changed Chinese political thought. Originating in the early Zhou dynasty, the mandate of heaven held that heaven, Tian, granted the right to rule to virtuous kings and could withdraw it from corrupt ones. Initially, this was a means to justify overthrowing the Shang dynasty. But for Confucius, it became something deeper, a moral covenant between ruler and ruled. Though he seldom spoke of the supernatural, Confucius held a deep reverence for Tian, which he saw as a moral order imbued in the cosmos. He once said, "He who does not understand the mandate cannot be a noble man." Analects 20.3. For Confucius, heaven's mandate was not maintained through military victories or political intrigues. It was preserved by the ruler's commitment to Ren, or humaneness. The ruler was not divine. He was a servant of heaven, entrusted with the welfare of the people. This gave power a moral weight. It was not a right to be seized, but a duty to be fulfilled. And when rulers failed in that duty, they forfeited their legitimacy, not in the eyes of men, but in the eyes of heaven. One of Confucius's most enduring contributions to the philosophy of power was his ideal of the Junzi, often translated as gentleman, but perhaps better rendered as noble person. The Junzi is not noble by birth, but by character. He is the moral elite, the cultivated leader, the one whose words and actions are in harmony with the way, Tao. In a society riddled with aristocratic privilege and class barriers, this was a radical idea that nobility could be achieved, not inherited. Confucius urged rulers to become Junzi and to surround themselves with others who embodied this ideal. He lamented that too many princes surrounded themselves with flatterers and sycophants rather than with upright ministers who dared to speak the truth. The Junzi leads by example, practices self-discipline, and upholds the rituals not as empty performances, but as vehicles of moral cultivation. He teaches, the noble person considers what is right, the petty person considers what is profitable. Analects 4.16. In this, we see Confucius's disdain for utilitarian politics, the idea that power is justified by results alone. No, he says, power must be rooted in righteousness. Why? Not expediency. Lie. For Confucius, power without structure was chaos, and the structure of society was maintained through lie, ritual, propriety, and etiquette. But Li was more than bows and ceremonies. It was a codified expression of harmony, a way to align human behavior with the rhythms of nature and society. It governed relationships between ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger. Through Li, power was not merely exercised, it was contextualized, restrained, and humanized. Confucius saw the loss of Li in his time as a symptom of moral decay. He argued that only by restoring Li could rulers create a stable and just society. He said, if the people are led by laws and uniformity is sought through punishments, they will try to avoid the punishment but have no sense of shame. If they are led by virtue and uniformity is sought through lie, they will have a sense of shame and will become good. Analects 2.3. In this vision, power is not brute force. It is a moral performance, enacted through ritual, embedded in tradition, and aimed at cultivating virtue in both ruler and ruled. Confucius believed that power must be educated, not merely in strategy or administration, but in virtue, history, music, and poetry. He emphasized learning, exu, as a lifelong process of self-cultivation. His own disciples came from varied backgrounds, not aristocrats only, but commoners who sought wisdom. He taught, by nature men are nearly alike, by practice they grow far apart. Analects 17.2. This was a revolutionary idea, that moral excellence, and thus the right to wield power, was not predetermined by birth but nurtured through study and ethical refinement. Education became a means of social mobility and a cornerstone of Confucian governance. In imperial China, this principle would blossom into the civil service examination system, through which scholar officials were selected not by lineage, but by mastery of the Confucian classics. For centuries, the pen would outweigh the sword as the key to power. Power, Confucius knew, could corrupt. Therefore, his philosophy emphasized humility, introspection, and restraint. He taught that the ruler must first govern himself. Only then could he govern others. To govern is to rectify. If you lead by being correct, who will dare not be correct? Analects 12.17. Confucius embodied this principle in his own life. Though he sought political office, he refused to compromise his ethics for advancement. He traveled from state to state, offering his counsel, often rejected or ignored, yet never abandoning his ideals. He warned against rulers who sought glory over righteousness, and against ministers who prioritized obedience over integrity. His humility was not weakness, but wisdom. Power, he taught, must be wielded with reverence, for the people, for the ancestors, and for the Tao. Confucius did not die a powerful man. He died a disappointed idealist, his political dreams unfulfilled, his teachings not yet embraced by the rulers of his day, and yet his vision would outlast kingdoms. In the centuries that followed, Confucianism would become the ideological foundation of the Chinese state. Emperors would quote his Analects, dynasties would build academies in his name, and scholars would devote lifetimes to interpreting his words. Some would distort his teachings to justify authoritarian rule. Others would revive his true message, that power is not domination, but duty, not control, but character. In our modern world, where power often dazzles and corrupts, the teachings of Confucius remain a quiet summons to virtue, a reminder that the greatest rulers are not those who conquer, but those who inspire. As he once said, to lead uninstructed people to war is to throw them away. Analects 13.30. And perhaps the most profound teaching of all. The master said, the virtue of the noble man is like the wind. The virtue of the petty man is like the grass. When the wind blows over the grass, it inevitably bends. Analects 12.19. Thus, we return to the beginning. What did Confucius really teach about power? He taught that power begins within, that to rule others, one must first rule oneself, that greatness lies not in conquest, but in compassion, not in might, but in moral example. And in doing so, he gave the world not just a political theory, but a timeless path toward human flourishing.